Welcome to Legend Lantern Radio, where stories are lit by memory and emotion. Tonight, I'll share with you a tale called The Clock That Stopped at Happiness. It is the story of a small seaside town where a mysterious clock appeared, promising what everyone desires most, eternal happiness. But can happiness truly be trapped within the hands of time? Join me, and together we'll find the answer. The Clock That Stopped at Happiness, Act 1, The Discovery. Eleanor Whitmore had lived in the little coastal town of Greyhaven all her life. It was the kind of place where sea fog clung to the windows in the morning and gulls circled endlessly above the fishing docks. People here grew old in the same houses their grandparents had once built, and time seemed to move more slowly than anywhere else in the world. Eleanor's family had owned a watch shop on Main Street for nearly 70 years. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had been a patient, meticulous man who could listen to the tick of a broken watch and immediately know what was wrong with it. He passed away quietly 5 years ago, leaving Eleanor the store. And though she never had his gift for mending gears and springs, she could not bring herself to close the shop. She kept it open mostly out of loyalty and a sense of duty. The shelves were lined with pocket watches, mantle clocks, wristwatches, and alarm clocks that had belonged to customers long gone. Few people in Greyhaven still needed clock repair. Digital watches and smartphones had made the craft nearly obsolete. But Eleanor dusted the cases each morning, wound the clocks that still worked, and sat by the counter with a pot of tea, keeping her father's memory alive. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early November, Eleanor decided to clean out the attic above the shop. She rarely went up there. The ceiling beams were low, and the air smelled of cedar and dust. Boxes stacked upon boxes contained decades of forgotten things. Invoices yellowed with age, spare gears, broken pendulums, cracked glass faces. She was about to call it a day when something caught her eye at the far end of the attic. Propped against an old trunk was a wooden clock unlike any she had ever seen in her father's collection. Its case was made of dark walnut, worn smooth by time, with delicate carvings of vines winding up the sides. The glass front was fogged with dust, but behind it she could make out two hands, stopped at exactly 2:37. She wiped the glass with her sleeve. The clock face was simple, almost plain, with Roman numerals etched in faded black. There was no maker's name, no inscription, no sign of origin. Yet something about it felt alive. She leaned closer and, to her astonishment, heard a faint ticking sound. But the hands weren't moving. Eleanor frowned. That wasn't possible. If the gears inside were moving enough to tick, the hands should move as well. She picked up the clock, it was heavier than she expected, and carried it downstairs into the shop. Placing it on her father's old workbench, she wound the keyhole carefully. The resistance was unusual. Not stiff, but reluctant, as though the clock itself didn't want to be disturbed. The ticking grew louder, steady, rhythmic. Still, the hands stayed frozen at 2:37. She checked the back for any writing and found a small brass plate, tarnished nearly green. Scraping at it with her fingernail, she uncovered faint lettering. 12 May 1975. Her breath caught in her throat. That was the day her father had first met her mother. She knew the story well. How her father had wandered into the Greyhaven library during a storm, dripping wet, and found a young woman shelving books by candlelight. They'd spoken for hours, forgetting the storm, forgetting time. By the end of that evening, they knew they would never part. Eleanor had always thought of that date as the beginning of everything, the love story that eventually brought her into the world. And here on this strange clock, that exact day was engraved like a memory trapped in brass. She leaned closer again, listening to the ticking. For a moment, the shop seemed to fade. The rain outside quieted. The hum of the refrigerator in the back room stopped. All she could hear was the clock. Tick, tick, tick. And then, without warning, her mind filled with a memory. She was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a sheet of arithmetic homework. Tears blurred the numbers. She had tried so hard, but the answers didn't add up. She'd failed the quiz at school and thought she was stupid. Her mother came in, knelt beside her, and whispered, "You don't have to be perfect, Ellie. You just have to be you. That's enough." Her mother's arms wrapped around her, warm, safe, smelling faintly of lavender. Eleanor felt the same rush of comfort, the same shiver of relief, as if it were happening again, right here, right now. She gasped and stumbled back from the workbench. The vision dissolved. The shop returned, the rain, the hum, the shelves of clocks. The carved walnut clock sat silent, hands still frozen at 2:37, ticking faintly as though mocking her. "What in the world?" she whispered. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a ripple of something she hadn't known she was missing. Wonder. Eleanor Whitmore had always thought of time as both a friend and an enemy. In Grey Haven, the small coastal town where she was born and raised, time seemed to stretch and fold in strange ways. Summers lingered, golden and slow, with children leaping from the dock into the cold Atlantic water, while winters pressed in tightly, days swallowed by fog that crept down from the cliffs. Outsiders who visited for a season often joked that their watches ran differently here, as if Grey Haven had a rhythm all its own. For Eleanor, time had always been measured by the clocks. Her father's shop sat halfway down Main Street, its window crowded with pendulums and carriage clocks, wristwatches displayed like jewels, and cuckoo clocks with tiny wooden birds forever waiting to spring forward. As a child, she had spent countless afternoons watching her father at the workbench, his magnifying glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his steady hands coaxing life back into stubborn gears. "Every clock has a heart," he used to say, letting her hold the tiny brass wheels that glimmered in his palm. "When it stops, you don't scold it. You listen. You listen until it tells you what it needs." Her mother would laugh from the kitchen in the back, calling out, "Don't fill her head with your magic tricks, Thomas." But Eleanor knew her father wasn't joking. He spoke of clocks the way other people spoke of friends. To him, each one carried a memory, a life, a rhythm unique to itself. After his death, she tried to carry on the tradition. The shop became her anchor, even if business was nearly gone. Tourists still wandered in now and then, charmed by the ticking symphony of 100 clocks, and sometimes old townsfolk brought in heirlooms too delicate to throw away. Mostly, though, it was just Eleanor and the steady company of seconds. It was on a wet Tuesday in November that she found the clock. The attic was cluttered with boxes that smelled of cedar and dust, stacks of forgotten invoices, and crates of clock faces that had long since lost their hands. The light bulb overhead buzzed faintly, threatening to give out, and Eleanor muttered to herself as she moved aside a tower of ledgers. That was when she noticed the object leaning against an old trunk, half covered in a moth-eaten blanket. The walnut case was carved with vines that seemed to twist naturally, as if they had grown rather than been carved by a craftsman's knife. The glass was fogged with years of neglect, but the faint shape of frozen hands caught her eye. She tugged the blanket away, sneezed at the rush of dust, and stared. 2:37. The hands were frozen there, immovable. Yet as she pressed her ear to the glass, she heard it, the faint, steady ticking of something alive inside. Her father had repaired thousands of clocks, and she had learned enough to know that ticking without movement was impossible. A gear turning meant the hands must move. If the hands were stuck, the ticking should have died long ago. Carrying it downstairs, she placed it gently on her father's old bench. The shop was quiet except for the patter of rain on the front window. She searched the back and found the tarnished brass plate, nearly green with age. With her fingernail, she scraped until the numbers revealed themselves. 12 May 1975. The date burned into her mind. She remembered the story her parents had told over and over. Her mother had been the librarian then, 22, wearing her hair tied back in a braid. A storm had trapped her in the library, and her father had wandered in, soaked through from the rain, pretending he needed a book on navigation, but really just looking for an excuse to stay dry. They talked for hours, lit by a single lamp. By the time the storm passed, it no longer mattered. They had found something greater than shelter. That date was carved into Eleanor's own life. Without it, she would never have existed. And here it was, etched on the back of a clock that should not even exist in her family's collection. She wound the keyhole carefully. Resistance shivered through her fingers, as though the mechanism resented her intrusion. Still, the ticking grew louder, clearer, and still the hands did not move. Her eyes blurred. The shop dimmed. She smelled lavender. She was 8 years old again. The homework paper blurred with tears. She could not add the numbers correctly. Her teacher's scolding still rang in her ears. "You must try harder, Eleanor. You'll never succeed if you give up so easily." But then her mother was there, kneeling beside her, wrapping her in warm arms, whispering words that changed the air itself. "You don't have to be perfect, Ellie. You just have to be you. That's enough." The shame drained away, replaced by relief so profound it made her sob. And as she sat in her shop decades later, she felt it again, whole and undiminished, as though time itself had folded to hand it back to her. She stumbled away from the workbench, clutching her chest. The vision faded. Rain returned. Clocks ticked. Reality reassembled itself. The walnut clock stood unmoving, hands still frozen at 2:37. But something had changed. For hours, she tried to convince herself it had been exhaustion or the trick of a grieving mind. She made tea, paced the floor, even opened the front door to feel the damp November air on her face. Yet the image lingered. Her mother's arms, the lavender scent, the truth of it. Finally, curiosity overcame fear. She brought the clock into the front room and set it on the counter. She placed both palms against its glass face. At first, nothing. Only the tick. But then came another rush of memory. This time she was 16, standing awkwardly on a gymnasium floor at the high school dance. Her dress was borrowed, her shoes a size too small. She had expected to go home unnoticed. But then a boy she barely knew had walked over, smiled nervously, and asked if she would dance. For the first time in her young life, she felt seen, not for her grades, not for her family name, but for herself. The music swelled in her ears. Her feet moved clumsily, but the boy laughed with kindness, not cruelty. Happiness had been so sharp that night it frightened her. And here, decades later, the memory returned in full, warm and overwhelming. When she pulled her hands away, her own reflection in the shop window startled her. Her cheeks were flushed as though she had actually danced. Her breath quickened. The clock stood silent. Still at 2:37, she whispered into the empty shop, "What are you?" The clock, of course, did not answer. It only ticked, steady and patient, as though waiting for her to listen again. Act 2, The Mystery. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with the sound of ticking still in her ears. It was not the familiar chorus of the shop below, where 100 clocks beat their tiny wooden hearts in syncopated rhythm. No, this was different, singular, steady, insistent. As if the walnut clock had followed her into sleep and whispered to her dreams. She rose before dawn, pulled a sweater over her nightdress, and went down to the shop. The fog outside pressed thick against the windows, turning the lamps of Main Street into pale smears of yellow. She lit the small heater behind the counter, then approached the clock where it still sat on her father's bench. 2:37. It had not moved. Yet when she placed her hand against the glass, the ticking rose up like a pulse beneath her skin. For a moment she felt her own heartbeat fall into rhythm with it. She snatched her hand away, trembling. "This is madness," she told herself. But the madness had already taken root. By midday, the first visitor arrived. Mr. Alcott was one of Grey Haven's elders, a fisherman retired years ago, his skin leathered by salt and sun. He shuffled into the shop, leaning on his cane, nodding politely as he always did, and asked after a pocket watch he had left for repair months earlier. Eleanor fetched it from a drawer, but as she placed it on the counter, she saw his eyes drift past her shoulder. "To the workbench," he said slowly. "That clock. Where did you find it?" Eleanor hesitated. "In the attic." "Why?" Mr. Alcott's mouth worked silently for a moment before he whispered, "I thought it was gone. Your father told me once he'd hidden it away." Her heart quickened. "You know this clock?" I touched it many years ago," the old man said. His voice shook, not from age, but from something deeper, something fragile. "It showed me the day my son was born. I could feel him in my arms again, a squirming little thing, bawling his lungs out. And He broke off, clearing his throat. "I never forgot it. Your father said it wasn't meant for us to keep. He put it away." Eleanor stared. "You're saying the clock showed you a memory?" Not just showed. Mr. Alcott's eyes glistened. It gave it back. I smelled the hospital antiseptic, heard my wife's laugh. For a few seconds, I was there again, happy. A silence stretched between them. The rain tapped softly at the window. Finally, Eleanor said, Would you like to touch it again?" The old man's hands shook as he reached forward. She guided him carefully to the workbench. When his palm rested on the glass, his lips parted in awe. A tear rolled down his cheek. After a long minute, he withdrew, clutching his cane with both hands. "It hasn't changed. It still holds the moment." He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and warning. "Eleanor, this clock is a blessing and a danger. People will want it. Some will need it too much. Be careful." He left without another word. But word, as always, found its way through Greyhaven. Within days, others came. Mrs. Callahan, who lost her husband 20 years ago, young Matthew Turner, who had buried his dog last spring, and even children, curious about the whispers their parents shared. Each one asked timidly, almost ashamed, if they might touch the clock. Eleanor tried to refuse at first, remembering Mr. Alcott's warning. But the pleading in their eyes undid her. She let them rest their palms against the glass, one by one. She watched their expressions shift from skepticism to wonder to tears. Each described something different afterward. A wedding day, a first kiss, the taste of ice cream on a hot July afternoon with a grandfather long gone. It was never pain, always joy, always happiness, captured in amber and returned. Soon the shop was no longer empty. Each day people lined up quietly, respectful of the strange gift Eleanor guarded. She became less a shopkeeper and more a caretaker of memories. But beneath the gratitude, she began to notice something else. One evening, as she closed the shop, Eleanor found Mrs. Callahan still standing by the clock, her hand pressed firmly to the glass. "It's time, Mrs. Callahan," Eleanor said gently. The widow did not move. Her eyes were distant, as though she were somewhere far away. Only after Eleanor tugged softly at her arm did she blink and step back, murmuring apologies. I didn't want to let it go," she whispered. "For a moment, I had him back. I could feel his hand in mine. Leaving it behind is like losing him all over again." That night, Eleanor lay awake, troubled. The clock gave joy, yes, but it also stirred longing that could never be fulfilled in the present. The next morning, young Matthew Turner returned, demanding another chance. His small fists pounded the counter. "It was my dog, Miss Whitmore. He was licking my face again. Please, please, let me see him once more." His mother dragged him away, red-faced with embarrassment, but Eleanor could not shake the sound of his sobbing. The clock was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a hunger. She began to experiment, hoping to understand it better. One night, she sat alone in the shop. All other clocks wound down so their ticking would not distract her. She placed both hands on the walnut clock and closed her eyes. This time, she felt herself pulled not backward but sideways, into a memory she barely knew she carried. Sitting in the grass outside Greyhaven High, sketchbook on her knees, the wind tugging at her hair. Her father had walked up with 2 ice cream cones, pretending to have bought the wrong flavor just so she could have her favorite. She laughed, truly laughed, for the first time after a difficult year. The memory ended too soon. She opened her eyes, tears slipping down her face. The clock was not random. It was personal. It gave each person their happiest moment, wrapped in the illusion of presence. But why had her father hidden it away? The answer came 1 week later, in the form of a letter tucked into an old repair ledger she found while cleaning. Her father's handwriting marched across the page, steady and deliberate. The clock of May 12, 1975 is not an ordinary mechanism. It does not measure time, it holds it. I believe it captured the moment your mother and I met. From that instant onward, it ceased to move, as though it had no need. I tested it with others. It showed them their own happiest moments. But I fear its power is not benign. Some who touched it lingered too long, losing their taste for the present. To live in memory is not to live at all. I have hidden it away. If you find it, Eleanor, be wiser than I was. Do not let it own you. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter. The shop was silent around her, but in the silence, she thought she heard the clock's ticking grow louder, almost like laughter. Act 3, The Temptation. Greyhaven was changing. What had once been a quiet harbor town of seagulls, fishermen, and shopkeepers now carried a strange hum in the air. Not a sound exactly, but a pulse, a restless undercurrent. People still went about their days. Fishing boats sailed at dawn. The bakery opened with its usual cinnamon scent. The school bell rang. But conversations always circled back to one subject: the clock. Eleanor noticed it in the way customers glanced past her shoulder when entering the shop, eyes darting to the workbench before meeting hers. She noticed it in the way strangers, who rarely visited Greyhaven, began to appear. Relatives of townsfolk, curious travelers, even a professor from the university in Portland who claimed to have heard rumors of a temporal artifact. The shop was crowded now, every evening. She had to place chairs along the wall for people waiting their turn. They sat quietly, like patients in a doctor's office, but their silence was heavy with desire. When their moment came to lay a palm on the clock, Eleanor saw their faces melt into joy, into grief, disguised as bliss. And each time she saw it, a voice inside whispered, "Why not one more look, Eleanor? Why not give yourself another taste of your happiest moment?" One night, after the last visitor had left and the shop lay in darkness, Eleanor did what she swore she would not. She pressed both hands against the glass. At once, the world dissolved into sunlight. She was 16 again, sitting in the field outside Greyhaven High, laughing with ice cream dripping onto her fingers, while her father teased her about her messy eating. His voice, warm and gentle, filled her ears. "You'll grow older, Elle. The world will weigh on you. But never forget this. Happiness is not rare. It is waiting everywhere, if you let it in." She wanted to stay. She wanted to live inside this bubble forever, where her father was alive and the future had not yet stolen him away. She felt her body relax, her breath slowing, as though she were merging with the memory. But then, she heard another sound, the pounding of the shop's front door. She tore her hands away. The field vanished. She was back in the dark shop, heart racing, cheeks wet with tears. The knocking grew louder. It was Matthew Turner's mother, pale and frantic. The boy had run away from home, she said, and she was sure he was trying to get into the shop. Together, they searched the dim streets. They found him at dawn, curled up on the shop's back steps, shivering from the cold. His eyes, when he looked up, were desperate. "I just wanted to see him again," he whispered. Eleanor pulled him into her arms, but in her heart she felt a stab of fear. The clock was no longer just a curiosity. It was becoming an addiction. Over the next weeks, the lines outside the shop grew longer. Some came from neighboring towns now, strangers who had heard whispers of a miracle clock that gives back joy. Eleanor tried to turn them away, but money was pressed into her hands, and faces pleaded with such raw hunger that she faltered. One man drove 2 hours from Bangor, carrying a photograph of his late wife. "Just one touch," he begged. "I don't need anything else in this world. Just one more kiss from her, even if it's only in my mind." Another woman returned night after night, her visits stretching longer each time, until Eleanor practically had to drag her away. And still the clock ticked. 2:37. Always 2:37. The shop was no longer hers. It was the clock's. She turned again to her father's letter, reading the words until they blurred. "Do not let it own you." But what did ownership mean? She still controlled who touched it, didn't she? She was still the gatekeeper. If anything, wasn't she protecting people by allowing them measured moments instead of letting them stumble into it uncontrolled? And yet, each night she found herself craving another look. Each night she resisted, until one evening when her loneliness outweighed her fear. She pressed her hands once more to the glass. This time, the memory was different. Not the ice cream in the field, but the day of her parents' anniversary. They danced in the kitchen, her father spinning her mother clumsily while Eleanor clapped along. The room was filled with music and laughter. Her mother's perfume lingered in the air. She sank into it, every detail sharper than any dream. When the memory ended, she found herself gasping, heartbroken by its absence. The temptation grew teeth. Not everyone responded with joy. One evening, a fisherman named Doyle slammed his fist against the counter. "It lied to me," he barked. "It showed me nothing, just blackness." Eleanor frowned. "That's impossible. Everyone sees something." "Not me. Nothing but dark." His eyes narrowed. "Maybe my happiest moment hasn't come yet. Maybe it never will. What kind of curse is this, showing me I've lived my whole life without a single joy worth keeping? He stormed out, leaving a chill in his wake. For the first time, Eleanor wondered if the clock truly offered happiness, or if it judged. The town council soon became involved. Rumors of unrest spread, neighbors arguing, people skipping work to stand in line at her shop. Father Brennan, the priest, visited her one evening. "This clock of yours," he said softly, "it may be a gift, but it may also be a snare. You must see how people cling to it." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "Then you must end it." She shook her head. "How? Destroy it? It's the only place I can see my father again." Her voice cracked. The priest's eyes softened with pity. "Then it tempts you too, and that is the proof you need." He left her with that thought. The breaking point came one stormy night. A group of townsfolk gathered outside, demanding entry even though Eleanor had closed early. They shouted through the rain, their voices angry, desperate. Someone hurled a stone, shattering a window. Eleanor barricaded the door, trembling, the ticking of the clock loud in her ears. "Give it to us," voices roared. "We deserve it. You have no right to keep it." She clutched the clock in her arms, backing into the shadows of the shop. For the first time, she saw not a gift, but a curse, an object that could unravel her town, one memory at a time. And yet, when the mob finally dispersed and silence returned, she sank to her knees, hugging the clock close. Because the truth, the terrible truth, was this: she did not want to let it go. Act 4. The Confrontation. Greyhaven had never known violence. It was a town of fishermen and quiet shopkeepers, a place where doors were left unlocked and disputes ended with muttered apologies. But after the night of the storm, something inside its people had shifted. The clock had done it. Eleanor knew this as she swept glass from her shattered window the next morning. Whispers curled through the town square like smoke, rumors that Eleanor was hoarding the clock's power, that she was selling happiness only to those she favored, that she planned to take it away from Greyhaven entirely. The faces she passed on the street no longer smiled at her. Some turned away, ashamed. Others glared openly. The lines outside her shop were gone. Instead, there was silence. An uneasy silence that told her the townsfolk were waiting for something. That something arrived 3 nights later. It began with a knock, not at her shop door, but at her home. Mayor Caldwell stood there, flanked by 2 councilmen and Father Brennan. The mayor's hat dripped rain onto his shoulders, and his voice was carefully measured. "Eleanor," he said, "we need to talk." They gathered in her parlor. No tea was poured. The air was too brittle for kindness. "The town is unsettled," Caldwell began. "People are restless. Families are fighting. We've had one man quit his job to sit outside your shop day and night. Another," he hesitated, "another tried to harm himself when he wasn't granted entry." Eleanor's throat tightened. Father Brennan leaned forward. "Child, you know what this means. The clock is no blessing. It is a temptation too great for mortal hearts. But it helps them," Eleanor argued. "It shows them their happiest moments. It brings peace to grief, comfort to sorrow. Should I deny them that? Comfort?" Brennan's voice sharpened. "Or illusion. They are not living, Eleanor. They are clinging to shadows." Caldwell placed a hand on the table. "We are asking you, for the good of Greyhaven, to surrender the clock to us. The council will decide what to do with it, whether to store it away or destroy it." Eleanor's pulse pounded. Give it up? The thought made her chest ache. Without the clock, she could never see her father again. Never hear his voice reminding her that happiness was everywhere. "No," she whispered, "I can't." "Eleanor, I said no." She stood, trembling. "It was my father's. It is mine now. I won't hand it over." The mayor's jaw tightened. "Then I fear this matter will not end peacefully." They left, but the seed was planted. By morning, townsfolk gathered outside her shop, not in line, but in protest. Signs painted hastily on driftwood boards read, "Share the clock," and "No more secrets." Children clutched their mother's skirts, staring with wide, confused eyes. Eleanor stayed inside, shades drawn. Each shout from the crowd pierced her like a nail. That night, she dreamt of the clock whispering her name. When she woke, she found herself standing at her workbench, hands trembling inches above the glass. She jerked them back, horrified. She could not even trust herself anymore. 2 nights later, the confrontation came. The crowd returned, larger this time. Half the town, torches flickering against the dark. Caldwell tried to calm them, but the voices rose above his own. Give it to us! You don't own happiness. Destroy it before it destroys us. Eleanor locked the door, clutching the clock to her chest. Its tick echoed like thunder in her ears. Suddenly, a rock crashed through the window, then another. Glass rained down. The mob surged forward, hands grasping through the broken frame. Eleanor! Caldwell's voice roared. Open the door before someone gets hurt. No, she screamed. You don't understand. It's not just a clock. It's my father. It's everything I've lost. Her voice cracked into sobs, but the mob did not relent. And then, through the chaos, young Matthew Turner slipped inside. The boy's small frame darted through a side window, unnoticed by most. He rushed to her, eyes wide with determination. Miss Eleanor, you have to let it go, he pleaded. It's hurting everyone. It's hurting me. I don't want to need it anymore. She stared at him, heart twisting. This boy, who had clung to the memory of his father so desperately, was now begging her for release. But release meant loss, and Eleanor did not know if she could survive it. The mob pounded harder. The door groaned under their fists. Eleanor sank to her knees, clutching the clock. The tick, tick, tick drilled into her skull. She thought of her father's words. Happiness is not rare. It is waiting everywhere, if you let it in. But was that true? Or was happiness only ever a fleeting shadow, caught once and never again? She looked at Matthew. His eyes shone with tears, but behind them was courage. Courage she did not feel herself. Slowly, Eleanor rose. She carried the clock past the broken window, out into the night, where the mob fell into sudden silence at the sight of her. Torches flickered, painting desperate faces in orange light. This is what you want, she cried, raising the clock above her head. This thing that gives you scraps of the past, that chains you to memories instead of letting you live? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was my father's gift, she said, voice breaking. But it is no gift. It is a cage, and I have been its prisoner too long. Caldwell stepped forward. Eleanor, what are you saying? She drew in a trembling breath. I'm saying goodbye. And with all her strength, she hurled the clock onto the cobblestones. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder. Gears and springs scattered like sparks. The ticking stopped. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. The mob stared, torches crackling in the silence. Then, a strange sensation washed over them all, like a breath released after years of holding it. Some wept, some gasped, some simply stood, dazed as though waking from a dream. Eleanor fell to her knees amid the wreckage, sobbing. A hand touched her shoulder. It was Matthew. You did it, he whispered. You freed us. She clutched him tightly, though her heart felt hollow. Because though the town was free, she was not. She would never again hear her father's voice, never again see his smile in that field of sunlight. The clock was gone, and all that remained was the question of whether happiness truly waited elsewhere, or whether she had just destroyed her last chance at it. Act 5. The Aftermath. The morning after the destruction, Greyhaven was quieter than anyone could remember. No hammering at shipyards, no vendors calling in the square. Just silence, heavy as fog, wrapping around the cottages and the cobblestone streets. Eleanor sat on the steps of her ruined shop, the broken window still gaping, shards of glass glinting in the weak light. Pieces of the clock lay in a small wooden box at her side, the only fragments she'd managed to gather from the street before dawn. She ran her fingers over a bent gear, cold and sharp. It felt like holding a piece of her own heart. At first, the townsfolk kept their distance. They shuffled past with lowered eyes, ashamed, as though uncertain whether to thank her or condemn her. By afternoon, Mayor Caldwell approached. His hat was in his hands, crumpled at the brim. You did what I could not, he said quietly. You ended it. Eleanor did not look up. I destroyed the only thing that made people happy. Caldwell sighed. No, you destroyed the thing that made them forget. He hesitated, then added, We'll rebuild. Together. But when he walked away, Eleanor felt no comfort. That night, she dreamed of her father. Not in the golden field of the clock's illusions, but standing in her workshop, exactly as she remembered, apron dusted with sawdust, hair untidy, eyes tired yet kind. He didn't speak. He simply smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. And when she woke, tears stained her pillow. But for the first time since his death, she realized she could still carry him. without gears, without ticking, without illusions. The town struggled in the days that followed. Without the clock, tempers flared. Husbands and wives who had once clung to its visions now quarreled bitterly. Children who had begged for glimpses of lost parents cried at night. For weeks, Greyhaven felt raw, like an open wound. But slowly, something changed. People began to gather in the square, not to demand the clock, but to share stories. Old Mrs. Donnelly started telling tales of her late husband, recounting how he used to carve whistles from driftwood for the neighborhood children. The widowed fisherman, Joseph, taught his daughter how to mend nets, passing on the skills his wife once held. The townsfolk found, little by little, that memories could live in words, in hands, in actions, not just in visions behind glass. And Eleanor watched, silent, as her neighbors began to stitch themselves back together. Still, her own heart remained heavy. Every morning she entered her shop, now bare where the clock once stood. She repaired watches, fixed cracked lenses, reset springs, work that was useful but hollow. Customers thanked her politely, but no one lingered. One evening, Matthew Turner came to see her. The boy carried a sketchbook under his arm, its pages smudged with charcoal. "I drew something," he said, shyly. He opened the book to reveal a picture of his father, not in perfect detail, but alive in gesture. The curve of his shoulders as he rode, the tilt of his head when he laughed. "It's not the same as the clock," Matthew admitted. "But when I draw, I remember him. And it feels real in a way the clock didn't." Eleanor's throat tightened. She reached out and touched the page gently. "You found your own way," she whispered. The boy smiled. "Maybe you can too." The seasons turned. Autumn bled into winter, and snow laid soft over the rooftops. Greyhaven was quieter, humbler, but steadier. One evening, as Eleanor closed her shutters, Father Brennan knocked at her door. "I misjudged you," he said simply. "I thought the clock was a curse, and I feared you were blinded by it. But I see now. It was not destruction that saved us. It was your courage to let go." Eleanor bowed her head. "I don't feel brave." "Few who are truly brave ever do," the priest replied. In spring, the Festival of Lanterns returned to Greyhaven for the first time in years. Families floated their glowing lights into the harbor, each one carrying a wish or a memory. The water shimmered with hundreds of tiny flames drifting toward the horizon. Eleanor stood at the edge of the pier, holding a lantern of her own. Inside, she had written just 4 words. "Happiness waits everywhere." She set it gently on the tide and watched it drift away, her chest aching and light all at once. That night, when she returned home, she opened the wooden box of clock fragments one last time. She spread the broken gears on her work table, their metal dulled but not lifeless. And then, carefully, she began to arrange them, not into a clock, but into something new, a wind chime. By morning, it hung outside her shop door, tinkling softly in the sea breeze. Not ticking, not binding memories, but singing, a reminder that joy could come from the simplest of sounds. When customers passed, they paused to listen, some smiling faintly. And though Eleanor still felt the weight of loss, she also felt, for the first time, that her father would have approved. Act 6. The Legacy. Decades passed and Greyhaven changed. The harbor that once rang with the clang of hammers and shouts of sailors grew quieter as ships modernized. Wooden vessels gave way to steel, and many of the old boatyards closed. Cobblestones were worn smooth by generations of feet, and new families arrived, knowing little of the town's strange history. But if you walked past the small lane where Eleanor Reed's shop once stood, you would still hear something, soft, delicate, carried on the sea breeze. The sound of a chime, its tinkling notes brushing against the years like fingertips on glass. No clock remained, only the wind chime. Eleanor herself grew old. Her hair turned silver, her hands slower, but her eyes still sharp. She no longer repaired watches. Her apprentices did that. Instead, she sat by the window, carving small wooden toys for children who passed her shop. Some nights, she still dreamed of the clock. Sometimes it was whole again, ticking gently. Sometimes it was nothing more than scattered gears. But she never woke longing to rebuild it. She had learned. Happiness was not a moment trapped in glass, but a thread that ran through sorrow, laughter, and time itself. One spring evening, near the Festival of Lanterns, a young woman knocked on her door. "Miss Reed?" the woman asked. She was no more than 20, with dark hair tied in a ribbon. My grandmother told me to find you. She said you once helped her father." Eleanor studied the girl's face. There was something familiar in her eyes, earnest, searching. Then she remembered. Matthew Turner, the boy with the sketchbook. The girl smiled shyly. "I'm Anna Turner. My father was Matthew." She placed a worn sketchbook on the table. Its edges were frayed, its pages yellowed, but inside Eleanor saw the same drawings. Boats on the harbor, men laughing at work, a father bending to show his son how to tie a knot. "He drew his whole life," Anna said softly. "He always told me it began with you, that the day you listened to his drawings was the day he found his way forward." Eleanor's hands trembled as she touched the sketchbook. "And what of him now?" "He passed last winter," Anna whispered. "But he left this to me, and he asked that I thank you." Eleanor felt her heart ache and warm all at once. She pressed the book to her chest, and for a moment, it was as though time folded, child and elder, past and present meeting in one breath. That summer, the townsfolk invited Eleanor to speak at the Lantern Festival. She had refused for years, too humble, too quiet. But this time, she accepted. The square was filled with families, their lanterns glowing like tiny suns in the dusk. Children laughed, couples held hands, elders leaned on canes. Eleanor stood before them, frail but steady, her voice carrying farther than anyone expected. "Many years ago," she began, "there was a clock in this town, a clock that promised happiness, but it was a lie. True happiness cannot be trapped behind glass or frozen in time. It lives here." She placed a hand over her chest. "In the memories we share, the lives we build, and the love we leave behind." The crowd was silent, listening. Some wept quietly. When she finished, she lit her lantern. Unlike the others, it bore no wish, no memory. Only one word, painted in bold strokes: live. The lantern drifted onto the water, and hundreds followed, until the sea shimmered like a mirror of the stars. Eleanor passed away in her sleep the following winter. She was found in her chair by the window, the sketchbook of Matthew Turner open on her lap, the wind chime singing softly outside. The town mourned her deeply, but they did not drape her memory in sorrow. Instead, they remembered her courage, her kindness, her stubborn belief that happiness was meant to be lived, not preserved. Years rolled on, children grew, parents aged, and still the wind chime sang. No one rebuilt the clock. No one wanted to. Instead, a small plaque was placed outside the old shop, which had become a library. Here once stood the clock that stopped at happiness. It was not the clock that saved us, but the woman who taught us to let go. Travelers sometimes asked about it, curious. The townsfolk would tell the story, though details blurred over time. Some said the clock showed visions. Others swore it trapped souls. Some insisted it was cursed. Others said it was blessed. But all agreed on one truth. Eleanor Reed's choice changed Greyhaven forever. And so the legend of the clock lived on. Not in ticking gears, not in illusions of golden fields, but in the hearts of a town that had once been broken and learned to heal. And whenever the wind blew through the harbor, carrying the sound of the chime, it was said that if you closed your eyes, you could feel happiness. Not trapped, not lost, but alive, moving forward with the tide. And so the story comes to a close, yet its echoes may linger quietly in your heart. Every tale is like a lantern, casting light upon the hidden corners of memory and emotion. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If these moments felt meaningful to you, don't forget to follow Legend Lantern so we may meet again on another night of storytelling. Wishing you a peaceful night and the sweetest of dreams.